Ladies and gentlemen, we have with us today Mr. Avinash and Mr. Anurag. Thank you, and over to you, Mr. Avinash.
A very good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this conference call on the Draft National Education Policy 2019. I'm Avinash. I lead the education team of Wipro Foundation, and as most of you know, the Committee for Draft National Education Policy submitted its report on May 31st, 2019. And the Ministry of Human Resource Development, interestingly, one of the recommendations of the policy is to rename it as Ministry of Education, seeking input suggestions on the draft. And as most of you already know, Wipro Foundation has been deeply invested in the area of school education for a couple of decades now, and we have a network of about 130 educational NGOs at present, working in various geographies and various areas of and aspects of school education. And and I'm delighted that we have, I think, about 70 odd participants representing about 40 of our partner organizations joining us on this call. It is also a privilege to have Anurag, who, as most of you already know, is the CEO of the Azim Premji Foundation and the Vice Chancellor of the Azim Premji University, and also the Chief Sustainability Officer of Wipro on the call. Anurag was a key part of the drafting committee of the Draft National Education Policy 2019. And, I would like to request Anurag to, begin the session with perhaps telling us a little bit about how Azim Premji Foundation institutionally and he personally came to be involved in the drafting of the National Education Policy. And also the nature of this engagement, and then we will take it on from there.
Thanks, Avinash. Good evening, everybody. I will take you to 3 steps. One, I will talk about how we came to be involved, as Avinash suggested. That will be very brief. Second, what I will do is that I will talk about some of the principles that are underlying the policy. They sort of tie it together, and if one articulates them before going into the policy, perhaps the policy seems more integrated. So that's part 2. Part 3 is that I'll just take you through the highlights of the policy. The policy is 484 pages long in English, so it's very hard to even talk about the highlights, all the highlights. So I'll just touch upon some of the things that I think are very, very important. Not that stuff that I'll not bring up are not important matters. It is just that given the time that we have, we can only talk about a few things. And then, of course, maybe after 20 minutes, 25 minutes roughly, I'll also take questions that I guess a lot of you have already sent to Avinash. Some questions apparently, or some questions that might occur to you and could send to Avinash, and he'll ask them to me. Right? So part 1, the policy, as most of you are familiar, is really being made after 1986. It was initiated in 2015, actually. It went through a few steps, ups and downs. And the Kasturirangan Committee was formed in May of 2017 to come up with a policy. And at some point in time, they requested whether we could provide support, given the fact that we are so focused on school education, which we said sure. And then subsequently, it got sort of formalized by the committee forming a drafting committee, of which I was a part. Right? That was our involvement. What it meant, of course, is that it has given us the privilege of being able to contribute to something which is so potentially seminally important, but also has been a wonderful experience for all of us. Right? So that's the background. I'm going to lead on to the second part of what I'm going to say, which is what I call the underlying principles. And principles is one kind of a word. One can say tenets, principles, philosophy, whichever way, right? So we'll talk about that a bit, and then I'll go on to the highlights of the policy. So talking about the principles, the first principle or the first underpinning of the policy is this, that the policy envisions education as a public good. It envisions education as something which is the obligation of the state to provide for all children, all students, high quality and equitable. What it basically means is that the policy is committing that there must be a robust public education system at school and the higher education level, and the state will invest everything that is required to be invested to make it high quality and equitable, and where capacities have to be added, that too as well. Right? So from a principal perspective, this is very critical. A commitment, an unambiguous commitment to strengthening, expanding, improving public education system from school up through higher education. Just as an aside, it is equally clear that education cannot be and will not be a business, commercial, for-profit activity. Philanthropically oriented private entities, philanthropists, can have a role. They can run education institutions, but they must be not-for-profit. But India's education system cannot be in any way anything other than a robust public education system. That's principle one. Principle two is that the policy is explicit in recognizing that there are economic aims of education, meaning that education should prepare our young to become economically self-reliant, to become economically independent, to be economic contributors to the country. But that's only one part of what are the aims of education. It clearly envisions education as a process, as an institutional set of mechanisms which helps develop the kind of society, the kind of country that we've envisioned in our constitution. And that entails many things. And therefore, in simple ways, it envisions education for the whole development of the human being and of citizens in this country. Right? And that's a very important reaffirmation to make, because as most of us are familiar, there has been a gradual erosion over the past 25, 30, 40 years of education narrowing into becoming a purely economic process in the minds of many. The policy is in a very strong reaffirmation that while clearly education has economic ends, the ends of education are way beyond economic. Right? So that's two. Three is this, that the policy explicitly recognizes that that education is at its core a very complex social human endeavor. What that means is that it requires extraordinary human tenacity and human capacity to be able to do a good job of education. What that means, quite simply, is that teachers are at the center of education. And therefore, there are implications of all kinds. Right? But very clearly, teachers are what make or break an education system, or make or mar an education system. And therefore, teachers must be invested into, teachers must be given support, teachers must be given importance, and so on and so forth. Right? So I think that's the third central principle, that education is a complex, deeply complex social human process, and therefore human agency, human intervention at the front line of education, which happens through teachers, must get its due importance in every possible way. The fourth matter of principle, and there are many other principles, I'm not going to be able to articulate all of them here. I'll stop with the fourth one. And the fourth is that if education has aims which are in the way I described them, and if it is a complex social human process enabled by the teacher or made to happen by the teacher, then all other elements of the education system must align in support of the teacher to make that kind of good education happen. What that means is that then the system must provide adequate resources, the system must provide the kind of culture that is enabling to the teacher, the system must have the regulatory culture and the administrative culture which enables this kind of education to happen. In a sense, that there must be a deep sense of integrity and consonance between the different elements of the education system with the purpose or the aims of education, and with the the basic idea and the basic notion that education is a complex social human process, right? So those are 4 matters of principles that are there. As I said, there are multiple other principles, and most of those principles can be also construed as corollaries to perhaps some of these principles that I talked about, but there are other principles. I'm not going to touch upon all of them, right? So that's sort of end of part 2. And part 2 was about principles. I'm going to move on to part 3, which is about some of the highlights of the policy. And as I said, I can only take some of the highlights, and which in no way means that there are not other important things or not other equally important things. There are, in this 484-page document, there are so many important things that they just can be sort of understood, appreciated only as you read through the entire policy. Right? So I'm taking the highlights, and I'm deliberately going to go through the highlights in the flow of the policy document itself. Meaning, I'll go sort of chapter by chapter, and I'll basically focus on the school education and the higher education side. There are chapters subsequent to that. I won't necessarily take them up, right? And I'm not going to cover all chapters. And this is quite deliberate because then for those of you who have read the policy already, or those of you who have not read the policy, then it sort of gives a frame as to what am I picking up, right? The start is really with this, what I think is one of the most transformative parts of this policy, is this extremely strong reaffirmation for the importance of early childhood education, and this absolutely explicit commitment of strengthening, expanding, improving a very high quality early childhood care and education system in the country. This that I'm talking about has multiple aspects as one can be imagined. I'll just touch upon 2, which is that from an institutional perspective, the policy states that the implementation of this must happen in a pragmatic manner. The policy states that, therefore, the Anganwadi system must be strengthened. Policy states that where possible, pre-primary classes must be there along with public schools. But there need not be some kind of a whole-scale churning institutionally. The important point is to make sure that early childhood care and education institutions which are high quality are available to all children in accessible distances. That's the important point. Second important point there is that it's quite clear that over the past 15, 20 odd years, the Anganwadi system has expanded. However, while it might be doing well or it might be doing in a mediocre manner its task of providing nutrition and other kinds of support to young children, it's quite inadequate on the matter of education. And therefore, the Anganwadi system does need to go through a significant, absolutely significant development of capacities and reorientation on how to take up this matter of early childhood education. This entails multiple dimensions of action. It entails most obviously a dimension of action on Anganwadi workers. They should be called teachers. They should have adequate education and training, and so on and so forth, right? So this is, I think, the first chapter, and is perhaps one of the most transformative elements of the policy itself. I'll mention something here in the context of this first chapter, and it has a direct relationship to Chapter 4, which is about curriculum and pedagogy, but I'll mention it only in the context of early childhood here. And the policy envisions that the entire school structure will be reformed and changed. And when I say the entire school structure will be reformed and changed, I'm referring here not to institutional restructuring, I'm referring here to curricular and pedagogical restructuring. And the curricular and pedagogical restructuring will happen in the format of 5 plus 3 plus 3 plus 4, meaning from age 3 to 8, which is up to grade 2, will be sort of one curricular block, one curricular pedagogical block. And this is age cohort based. And then what we call today class 3, 4, 5 will be the next curricular block. And then you will have 6, 7, 8, which is the next 3. And then you will have 9, 10, 11, 12, which is the 4. So that's how 5 plus 3 plus 3 plus 4, right? It's a significant departure from the way we have envisioned schooling, and it's based on the developmental stages of children. To come back to early childhood, and that's why I brought up the issue of 5 plus 3 plus 4 now. To come back to early childhood is envisioned not just ages 3 to 6, but it's actually envisioned ages 3 to 8. And the same kind of curricular approach would be adopted for this entire age cohort, really. Right? For this, a relevant curriculum needs to be developed at the national level, curricular framework, then at the state level, and so on and so forth. Right? I'm going to move on to chapter 2, but not without recapping that there is an explicit commitment to very, very high quality early childhood care and education for all children in this country. It is clearly backed by the growing body of evidence of the past 25, 30 years as to how important that age cohort is, not just at that age, but subsequently for life. Right? The second chapter is really not something transformative or dramatic in terms of concept or principles. It is just something dramatic and important from the here and now perspective. And the second chapter is really about ensuring that all children within 5 years from now are learning language and math at grade level in primary. And there's no further deficit subsequent to that. There are multiple sort of programs envisioned within the policy for that. All those programs are to help the teacher. None of them are substitute for the teacher. All those programs, like for example, there's something called the National Tutor Program. These are people who will help the teacher outside the classroom. But the focus of that particular chapter is really this, that there is a clear and complicated problem staring us in our face today, which is this of basic language and math, and that must be addressed, because if that's not addressed, we are sort of building a house of cards. Then there's the third chapter, which is really about ensuring there are no dropouts, and there's universal access to education. There are a few specific interesting points on this particular matter. I'll just point out two, which are one which I think is relatively novel, and one which is very, very important. What is important is that the RTE will get extended from age 3 to age 18. So instead of current 6 to 14, it will get extended from age 3 to 18. And it will come with many kinds of things, as you can imagine. For instance, the midday meal. Today it's not available for students beyond 14, so it will be available from 3 to 18, right? And in fact, the midday meal itself will be expanded, and it can then no longer be called the midday meal, because there also will be breakfast. So the first part about this, making sure that there is universal access and there are no dropouts, is about the right to education being expanded. That's part one. There are many other specific matters, but the one particular matter which I find interesting and novel is that there's an explicit commitment to appointing social workers in school complexes. And I'll come to school complexes in a bit. But there's an explicit commitment to appointing social workers. And what is this notion? The notion is quite simple, which is that there are many causes, many complex set of causes because of which children drop out of schools or don't join schools. Many of those causes are within the educational structure, within the educational institution and system, but many of those causes are outside the education system, within the community, within the family. How does one deal with that? There's no way to deal with that if the entire responsibility of that is given to teachers or to principals. They can't do it. They have got full jobs on their hand inside institutions. Certainly they should be connected with the community. Certainly they should play a role in the SMC and stuff like that. But the kind of effort required to make sure that communities understand, respond, are fully engaged in making sure that all children are going to school, it requires just a different order of effort. And therefore, there is appointment of social workers. We will have similar service conditions to teachers in all the school complexes. Right? I'm going to move on. I'm going to move on to Chapter 4, which is Curriculum and Pedagogy in Schools. Almost all of you are deeply into school education. This chapter is a chapter that I think would be very useful to read in great amount of detail. One important starting point of this chapter I've already mentioned, that the entire curricular restructuring of 5 plus 3 plus 3 plus 4, the 5 and the 3 and the 3 and the 4 refers to years, number of years, and it extends from up to grade 2, then grade 3, 4, 5, then grade 6, 7, 8, and grade 9, 10, 11, 12, which is seen as one block, right? So I think that's one important, very important part of this policy on the curriculum and pedagogy side. I'll just mention a few more, and then I'm going to move on. One, that there'll be no status hierarchy across subjects, fields, areas. So there'll be no notion of extracurricular, co-curricular, and so on and so forth. Everything will have the same status hierarchy, and that will be reflected in assessment, in crediting, grading, and so on and so forth. What that means is that music and art and sport and physics and math and vocational streams, all of them will be equally important. Right? And that's a reasonably radical departure from the notion of extracurricular, co-curricular, etc. Right? So that's one important point. The second important point is that if we are talking about the kind of capacities that school education must develop, critical thinking, constitutional values, ability to solve problems, social capacities, if all that is what is required as aims of education that we are working towards, then certainly a new national curricular framework that builds on the wonderful work that's happened in the past needs to be developed. But importantly, that national curricular framework must ensure that content load of the curriculum, and I'm being specific here, content load of the curriculum must be cut down substantially. Because over the past few decades, there has been a dramatic content creep. I mean, we're just weighing our children with extraordinary amounts of information and content in the syllabus, in the textbooks. And unless you reduce the content load and create the space for thinking, for engagement, for dialogue, there is no way the kind of important basic capacities that we are talking about can be developed. Right? So the content load matter is the other important matter. There are, as I said, there are many interesting things in this particular chapter. I'll just touch upon the one last one and then move on. The last one is I'm making a particular comment on in that 5 plus 3 plus 3 plus 4, I'm making a particular comment on the last 4, which is the class 9, 10, 11, 12. And class 9, 10, 11, 12 is, just for the sake of explanation here, that's not necessarily the way it is articulated in the policy, but just for the sake of sharper and clearer communication, 9, 10, 11, 12 is sort of envisioned as almost like a liberal arts program, meaning there are groups of subjects. So you have, physical sciences, biological sciences, humanities, math, arts, vocational studies, and stuff like that. You have groups of subjects. And through these, first during the 9th and 10th, and then subsequently in the 11th and 12th, the students are expected to take a certain number of credits across those groups. And this is the critical point. And what the curricular structure then ensures is that there's no such hard separation of saying, oh, I am PCM in 11th and 12th, or I am PCB, or I am commerce. All students will go through a rigorous and adequate exposure across disciplines and fields. And that includes, by the way, vocational fields. In 9th and 10th, there is, let's say, a fairly clear set of norms by which all students must be exposed to all these groups equally. When I say groups, I meant physical sciences, biological sciences, humanities, etc. In 11th and 12th, there is flexibility provided for students to be specializing. Specializing is too hard a word, maybe concentrating in a few of the disciplinary areas. But even then, they must be taking a certain number of credits from the other areas, right? When committed to this kind of a curricular restructuring, what will also happen is that the so-called board exams will be restructured fundamentally. And that restructuring, what it entails is that board exams as we know of them will, if the policy is implemented in full, will actually get demolished entirely. What will happen is there will be modular exams. To go back to the notion of credits, essentially, you will have modular exams which are giving you certain credits on the kind of courses that are there in each of the groups. To give an example, let's say in 11th, in humanities groups, all students are supposed to take 2 courses in humanities. And one student takes a course on medieval history of India. And therefore, that module will be assessed and that test will be provided multiple times during the year. And the student can then gain grades on that particular module and accumulate the credits across 9th and 10th. Right? Pretty much the way credit structures and their assessment operates at the college level. Right? So, let me summarize the 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th. The 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th is a fairly radical re-envisioning of how education should happen. It is it's attempting to ensure that all students are adequately exposed to all fields of human study, which are important to develop them. That's what it basically ensures. And importantly, there is no streaming across academic and vocational, right? And the structure provides relatively higher degree of flexibility for concentration in 11th and 12th. And on the other hand, redesigns the so-called board examination to achieve 2 objectives. One, it reduces the stress on children because you'll have multiple modules available for testing continuously. And also what it does, it reorients those assessments towards assessing the more fundamental capacities rather than assessing only procedural and memory. So I'm going to move on, and I think I'm taking more than I expected to, but I'm going to spend this time on school education a bit more and maybe a little less on higher education. I'm moving on to the chapter which is on teachers, and I'm going to combine the chapter which is on teacher education, which comes sometime later in higher education, which is chapter 15. So I'll make a few comments on teachers and teacher education together. First, on teacher education. On teacher education, the policy envisions a reformed, re-envisioned, restructured teacher education system. The ideas there are not novel at all. These are the ideas that have been stated by the Justice Verma Commission, by others at very many times. But those ideas are all put together here explicitly. Illustratively, that there will be only 4-year integrated B.Ed programs. Illustratively, that B.Ed programs can be run only inside multidisciplinary higher education institutions. You cannot have independent teacher education institutions. Illustratively, that there are thousands and thousands of bad, corrupt B.Ed colleges. They must be identified and shut down, and so on. So it basically talks about a radical overhaul of the teacher education system. It doesn't mince words at all. It is absolutely explicit in saying whatever it's saying. As I mentioned before, the ideas are not new. These ideas have been talked about at the very least for the past 7, 8, 9, 10 years in explicit detail, right? It just gives that backing explicitly. It also talks about in fair degree of detail about continuing professional development of teachers, right? We know that even as B.Ed or the teacher education system, the pre-service system improves, it is going to take a while before the effects of that are felt inside the school education system, and therefore it's very critical that we provide support to existing teachers. So that's on teacher education. On teachers, it has, I think, many important matters. Most of all, that teachers must have the central role in education, right? And the importance of the central role is actually going to be exhibited not by lip service, but by the kind of things that we're talking about. So if you're talking about teachers as being important, then we have to invest into their capacity. And that investment must be public investment. That teachers must be provided adequate resources. Most importantly, that adequate number of teachers must be appointed, and that there must be no para teachers, no Shiksha Mitras. All teachers must have equal status, right? And this is, again, from our system perspective, this one is a pretty radical thing, that the service conditions and compensation of teachers across classes, across the 5 plus 3 plus 3 plus 4 must be the same. And that is a very radical departure. As most of you know, teachers today are incented to go on from primary to so-called secondary to higher secondary because the service condition compensations are very, very different. Equating service conditions and compensation is a recognition that you need a very high degree of specialization and very high capacities to be able to be a primary teacher or an early childhood teacher as much as at the higher secondary level, right? There are very specific things on teacher accountability, and the teacher accountability, as you'll read through it, is very empathetic to the complex role of the teacher. What it basically does is that it says that there must be very clear accountability on matters over which the teacher has clear control. Illustratively, the teacher must come to the class. Illustratively, the teacher must try to teach. So these are matters of hard accountability, and then there are matters of responsibility, right? For instance, clearly the teacher has some degree of responsibility on what learning is happening or not happening, but there cannot be a hard line of accountability drawn to teachers because there are extraordinary number of complicating factors between what the teacher does and how and what a child learns, right? The teacher chapter has such radical measures, right? I'm going to move on. There's a set of measures recommended in Chapter 6 on inclusive and equitable education for various, I would say, all disadvantaged groups in our society, ranging from gender to disadvantaged regions of the country to people with disabilities to minority communities to transgender children, the entire range of underrepresented disadvantaged groups. There are specific measures that are talked about in that chapter. The matter of principle, let me highlight here. The matter of principle, which is, I think, very important, and the policy minces no words on this, is that if we are absolutely serious about providing equitable education to those who are disadvantaged and underrepresented, it can happen only when we commit to extra investment for them. What it basically means is that if the average per child expenditure is 20,000 rupees in the public system, let's say in the state of Karnataka or Gujarat or wherever, what it means is that we'll have to be investing maybe double that amount for groups that are disadvantaged. To give you an example, and I'm using an example that is used in the registration inside the policy, it's quite possible that a 30:1 pupil-teacher ratio is okay for children who come from socioeconomic backgrounds where there is adequate support available for them at home. But 30:1 may be just too much, absolutely too much, for children who have no support at home. And therefore, the pupil-teacher ratio for such disadvantaged communities should be 15:1, right? So I won't go into the details, but the matter of principle is that we have to provide high-quality, equitable education to the disadvantaged groups of our country, and for that, extra investment is required. I'm going to move on to governance and regulation, and that I'll touch upon very briefly, only conceptually. On the governance side, the basic principle of governance is empowering the schools and regulating on the basis of absolutely minimal criteria, right? And when I say minimal criteria, we know that in our country, if you have 500 criteria to regulate on, no regulation happens. So have minimum regulatory criteria, but regulate on that very effectively, very, very effectively, right? And then empower the schools. Right? That's sort of the principle behind this. Administrative unit of governance that is envisioned in the school is really now what we have called the school complex. It's not a new idea at all. It's there from Kothari Commission onwards. And essentially what it's saying is that you take a geographically sensible region, geographically proximate region, and pull together all the schools that are there, the pre-primary schools, the primary schools, the secondary schools, into one administrative unit, which is called the school complex. Just to be clear, the schools institutionally remain where they are. They are not being shut down or brought into one place. But in a school complex, there would be 15, 20 schools, including one integrated high school, right? And that is the primary administrative unit. It has many kind of advantages. If you read through the chapter, you will see some of the clear advantages. Some of the advantages are very basic resourcing advantages. Let me give you an example. Today we will talk, today the policy will say that there should be sports teachers and music teachers and so on and so forth. But there is no ability to appoint such sports teachers and music teachers. But when you start thinking of a school complex which has 15 schools, it's far more resource efficient and therefore easier to be appointing music teachers and sports teachers and all subject-based teachers because you're pointing to the complex, right? So the basic administrative unit will be the school complex with a substantial amount of empowerment there. On the regulatory side, and the regulatory side has its own complication because unless you get into the nitty-gritty, things don't become clear. I'll just state the matter of principle, and the matter of principle here is that when you look at the public system or when you look at the education system, the same bodies should not be playing different roles. What that means is, and that I'll give you a particular example with which it becomes hopefully clearer. If you look today, the Department of Public Instruction or the Directorate of Education, they not only run the schools, they also regulate the schools. So the BEO is also operating the schools and is also regulating the schools. So these functions will get separated out. There will be an independent regulator called the State School Regulatory Authority. And the job of the BEO, DO, etc. will just be to make sure that the public schooling system is improving. The SSRA, the School Regulatory Authority, as it's abbreviated, will regulate all schools, including public and private schools, right? So that's the sort of the matter of principle in there. I'm going to move on very quickly and perhaps spend 5 minutes on higher education, because some of the things are, in many senses, in higher education, a far more radical departure from the current situation than they are in school education. In school education, other than the matter of the dramatic investment in early childhood and the sort of the transformative nature of the curricular structure, a lot of the stuff that is there in school education is a very important reaffirmation of existing approaches and policies which have either been not done or left half done, right? But on the higher education side, much of what the policy states is in very many ways an absolute radical departure from what our higher education is today. In higher education, I'm not going to take you through chapters. I'll just point out a few highlights, and then I'm going to stop speaking, and then I'll open it up to questions, Avinash, for you. So, one, on higher education, it envisions an entirely new institutional structure. It envisions no affiliating universities. It envisions no affiliated colleges. It envisions that there will be no monofield institutions. What I mean by monofield institutions is engineering colleges, medical colleges, fashion technology colleges. It envisions an absolutely changed institutional set of structure. What it envisions is there will be all higher education institutions will be multidisciplinary institutions which will offer the entire range of undergraduate, graduate programs. And when I say multidisciplinary, I do mean humanities, physical sciences, social sciences, arts, vocational, professional, all those, right? So all institutions will be multidisciplinary institutions. One. Two, there will be only three kinds of institutions. One, universities that are focused on research but do teaching. Two, universities that do teaching but also do research. And three, colleges that basically do teaching. Now, there is implicit in this, but let me point it out very clearly. from the current situation of the 60-odd thousand colleges that are there, or higher education institutions are there, the policy envisions that this will be consolidated into about 15,000 colleges and universities. So a substantial reduction of the number of colleges and universities, but a substantial increase in the size of the individual college and university, and thereby an expansion of the capacity. Now, this intertwined process of consolidation to make bigger education institutions is absolutely necessary to have multidisciplinary institutions. Because unless you have large institutions with large students and a larger faculty, you cannot have multidisciplinary institutions. So this radical institution restructuring is a big part of the policy. The second big part of the policy is that then all undergraduate education in India should be liberal education, meaning all students sort of go in and they have the choice to do a mix of disciplines and fields. And of course, subsequently, they specialize into something. And also, this kind of liberal education would actually give the possibility to all students of multiple exits and multiple entries, meaning you join higher education and after 1 year, you could leave and come out with a certificate of higher education. After 2 years, you come out with a diploma. After 3 years, you come out with a BA or BSc. After 4 years, and the policy does talk about a 4-year undergrad degree, come out with a bachelor's in liberal arts or with a bachelor's with an honors degree, right? So, again, one is the radical institutional restructuring. 2 is the radical restructuring of the notion of undergraduate education to ensure that all undergraduate education is liberal education, and then, of course, leads to specialization. Right? Lastly, on higher education, and then I'll point out 2 more things and stop. Lastly, on higher education, the regulatory structure and the governance structure is envisioned to go through a complete transformation. Basically, when you'll have these 3 kinds of institutions, then they will be completely empowered. They will have full administrative, academic, and financial autonomy. And what I mean by financial autonomy is not that they will have to be fending for themselves to raise money, but there will be a long-term commitment by the public, by the state, for their funding, right? But they will be given complete autonomy. All these higher education institutions will be governed by independent boards. They will have the decision-making authority to appoint a vice chancellor, the directors, what have you. They will have the authority to decide which programs to run, what courses to run, what curriculum will be there, what curriculum will not be there, etc. Right? So they will have this complete autonomy. On the regulatory side, there will be only one regulatory authority called the National Higher Education Regulatory Authority. All other current regulatory authorities, which is NCI, NCT, etc., they will be reformed, transitioned out, and they will have no regulatory power at all. They will basically be professional standard setting bodies. They will just set the professional standards. They will have no regulatory role. And the professional standards that they set will really be used by the higher education institutions, the universities and the colleges, to inform their curriculum development, right? As you can imagine, this is a very radical re-envisioning or re-architecting of the higher education system, right? Envisioning this regulatory system where there's only one regulator, and which also therefore regulates on the basis of very minimal things. What it regulates on the basis is, 1, that there's probity and honesty in running the institution. 2, that it's a not-for-profit institution run for public purposes. And how will that get ensured? They'll get ensured by auditing norms that are as rigorous as that of Section 8 companies. And 3, that the institutions that are running have enough financial stability, whether through public sources or private sources, right? So, I'm going to stop on the higher education there. I'll just point out 2 more things and end with that. The policy envisioned something called the National Research Foundation. Those of you who are familiar with the National Science Foundation in the US or the National Institute of Health in the US, it's similar. This is an apex research foundation which will give out grants of about 20,000 crore rupees a year on a peer-reviewed basis to research and research ecosystems across all disciplines in the country, right? And the whole purpose of this National Research Foundation is to catalyze very high quality research across the country. The National Research Foundation will be governed by an independent board. It will be run by entirely independently, and will follow pretty much the kind of same rigorous peer review process that is there in those nations and countries which are clearly doing very well on research, right? So that's another element of the policy which does not necessarily directly fit into higher education, but is complementary to higher education. The last point with which I'll stop, and you can see that in the policy towards the end, is a new structure is envisioned, which is called the Rashtriya Shiksha Ayog, which essentially is there to be the custodian of this entire education vision. We know that education is a complex matter in itself. It's of course even more complex in a country of our kind, with its different constitutional status that different parts of the state have, and so on. And therefore, a body is envisioned which will align, orchestrate, hold the vision together and make things happen. This body will be headed by an independent board, and that body will basically be run by educationists and academicians, not by politicians and bureaucracy. The body will have political accountability because eventually the body will be headed by the Prime Minister as the chairperson. Right? And with that, I will stop. It just occurred to me that there are so many interesting things. One nugget I'll share, and then I'll stop with that, Avinash, and I'll hand it over to you. And that nugget is that the policy explicitly states that private schools cannot use public in their name. So we have a strange situation in our country where private schools, you call themselves public schools. So it states very clearly that once the policy is implemented, private schools can't call themselves public schools. Right? I mentioned this just as a matter of interest, not as a very critical and important point. So Avinash, I'm going to stop and hand it over to you. I've taken more time, but maybe to take a while.
Thank you, Anurag. Thank you so much for that, very comprehensive and insightful overview of the draft National Education Policy. I think most of the questions that our partners had sent have sort of already been addressed by this overview, but there may be a few, that are still left. So probably, if it's okay, then I could go one by one with these questions now.
Sure. Let's go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. So, one, given that most of us here are, part of NGOs or have our own NGOs, I think one set of questions is around around the role of NGOs, and if there is anything specific in the policy for that. I mean, there is a question from Mobile Pathshala, another for Thai Foundation, and around what role the NGOs can play in the overall education development, as well as the sort of effective implementation of the policy, and the future of CSO government relationship in furthering these, what are very welcome plans that are part of the policy. Is there anything specific that it mentions?
There are multiple places where this matter is referred to, and the essence of those multiple places is that the policy recognizes that education must be a collaborative effort, and while clearly the responsibility of providing high quality education is that of the state, but it must engage with and involve not-for-profit philanthropic efforts in education. So it's referred to, for instance, it's referred to in the context of continuous professional development of teachers. It is referred to in the context of school regulation. It's referred to in the context of a bit controversially, because some people have asked me the question. It's referred to in the context of also that not-for-profits can set up boards of examination. It's referred to very explicitly and very strongly in the in Addendum 1, which is called financing, that there must be specific role for not-for-profit, public-spirited institutions, and so on and so forth. So it also, and I'm at this moment not able to draw it from my memory, there's actually a specific clause which talks about how there must be enabling mechanisms that the state must work on to engage not-for-profits. Right? So there's a fair bit of that there. Tonally, it's encouraging of engagement of civil society.
Right. Okay. And this another set of questions that's clustered around sort of understanding, what exactly it is meant by the India-centered education that the policy seems to sort of make frequent references for. There's a question from Shamtale Foundation. What does this mean in relation to reviving Indian ancient wisdom and integrating with the mainstream curriculums? If you could just touch on that.
Yeah. I can tell you what it doesn't mean first, and then I will tell you what it means. Right? It does not mean saffronization. Right? So if anybody were to read through the policy in any detail, what it essentially is saying is this, that India and India's heritage, whether it is the linguistic heritage or the artistic heritage, and all other kinds of things, we should integrate it, and we should integrate it in a sensible fashion. And this is not about weird stuff that there was some genetic engineering available and stuff like that. Nothing at all, which is why it would be very useful to actually read through the specific clauses that are mentioned in this particular context, right? It actually also talks about where when you go to the research side of it, it also talks about it, that, there's a lot of stuff about the Indian heritage which actually has no real research, and people are just shooting in the dark and saying all kinds of stuff. So I know that question comes from, and there's already been public criticism or comment on this particular matter, and I was very surprised basically by a lot of the comment, because basically they have not read this, and they're criticizing just because the government that has been in power is the BJP government. Therefore, there's this visceral reaction that there's perhaps saffronization and stuff like that. There's nothing of that nature. It'll be interesting to go through this whole thing. The basic thing is, India, its heritage, its history, its whatever its languages are, they should be integrated in exactly in the same way that development in genetic sciences is being integrated in school curriculum. Similarly, it should be integrated.
Right. And there's one set of questions, Anurag, which is around the place of specific subjects in the policy. Now, I think that also sort of reflects perhaps some confusion around what's the role of the policy and what would be the role of the national documents such as the National Curricular Framework and so on. And in the policy itself, on some matters, it goes into fair degree of detail. So if you could also sort of clarify that a bit. In certain areas, the policy has gone into great detail, whereas in some areas, such as the place of certain subjects, such as in particular, I think there are questions around socio-emotional learning, physical education, and so on. They don't find any specific mention.
Let me just talk about let's call it the sort of strategy of that part. As to why is it articulated in the manner that it is articulated in, right? One of the choices that was facing us was that you write in the policy, basically, let's call it the goals. Let's call it the goals of education. And then thereafter, you leave it entirely to the development of the curricular framework, which is, mandated here. And let the curricular framework come up with the specifics to be able to fulfill those goals that are there. Right? And that could have been a valid enough strategy. And what we ended up choosing to do was that we ended up choosing to go into detail in some of the matters, which could have well been left for for the National Curricular Framework, but taking some stuff in and detailing it out to ensure that the National Curricular Framework doesn't miss it, right? So if you look at 4.6.1, there is a whole thing about scientific temper, right? There'll be some clear stuff about art and aesthetics. There'll be some stuff about physical education, wellness and sports. There'll be problem solving and logical reasoning. Now, this is not me suggesting that other things are not important. What it is suggesting is that this must be there. And for reasons, some of which can be, some of which are very clear, some of which are maybe not articulable very clearly, there were apprehensions that unless some things are gone into in greater detail, they may be missed out, or the emphasis will be missed out. Let's take 4.6.8, which is ethical and moral reasoning, and within that specifically development of constitutional values, right? Development of personal freedom. So it's basically a choice where we're saying, look, it's quite clear these are the educational goals. For that, National Curricular Framework has to be developed, and that can't be the task of the policy committee. However, we're just trying to emphasize that some things have to be there. Illustratively, those things are these. And using illustration doesn't mean that other things are not important, right?
Yeah. So we'll probably take 2 or 3 more questions. The next one is around, the current teachers in the system. I think there's one question from the Ferdinand Center, which essentially says that the new school structures and approach, with the teacher at the center changes, it requires a totally different teacher in knowledge, skills, mindsets, and so on. Now, but how will the teachers who are currently in the system already be able to meet the requirements? Are there things around that as well which has been envisioned and planned?
That comment is absolutely valid and accurate, right? That so even without this policy and its statement, most of us know that the kind of expectations that we seem to have from school education, our teachers, despite their hard work, despite their commitment, and very many of them are hugely committed and hugely dedicated. Despite that, they have not gone through the experience and education which can prepare for these kind of expectations. So that's a reality even without the way policy is stated it. Now, what the policy does is, one, in the long term, as I've already mentioned, it re-envisions entirely how teachers should be prepared. So in a 10-year time frame, the only way of preparing teachers will be this 4-year integrated program which is there in multidisciplinary institutions. Also, that these bad institutions are shut down. So in the long term, there is a path. Now, the question is, what about current teachers? And in the context of current teachers, I think there are 3 or 4 very critical things. Some of this I've already mentioned, but it's important to highlight that again. One is that there should be adequate number of teachers. And when I say adequate, it's subject-wise, grade-wise, there should be adequate number of teachers, because a lot of teachers are carrying very heavy loads. So if you don't have adequate number of teachers, as it is, a complex role is made even more complex. So adequate number of teachers. Second, that the teachers must get a conducive, motivating environment. And a conducive, motivating environment is both cultural, physical, administrative. So physical, for instance, and I think the policy mentions it somewhere, is that, if there are no toilets available and you're expecting the teacher to be teaching there for 8-9 hours, then, that's just at a very basic human level, denigrating the teacher and her status, right? So, then the policy also moves on, and that's why, from a perspective of earlier policy articulations, this is fairly unusual. There's a very long and detailed narration on continuous professional development of teachers and how continuous professional development or in-service teacher education needs to be reconfigured, realigned, reconstructed to make it effective, right? So, absolutely valid comment, and there is much that is envisioned there inside the policy. But like any such practical thing, my guess would be that a lot of it has to be done on the ground, which actually will start emanating from once we start re-architecting the role or the status of the teacher in the way we think of her in the education system.
Right. Next question is from NCF. Vena has written in, and she would like to know if education will continue to remain in the concurrent list. Is the policy proposing anything around that?
No, the policy does not have any point on that. I mean, the policy is presumed that it will continue to remain on the concurrent list.
Right.
It doesn't attempt to rebalance the constitutional status of how legislation can happen on this matter. Because this question was asked, I can also mention that clearly, if you go through the policy, there are multiple matters on which there will have to be both a legislative and a legal set of actions. What I mean by legislative action is that, for instance, RT has to be amended to go from 3 to 18, right? Legal strategy, what I mean is that, let's say, if the teacher education system has to be reformed, and part of that is shutting down, bad intentioned colleges, there will always be a legal challenge mounted from the part of the bad intentioned colleges. So there has to be legal strategy. So there is no change in the constitutional status of the subject itself, but there has to be a legal and legislative strategy.
So clearly, Anurag, there's many sort of strong points. I mean, there are of course some reiterations of points that were made by earlier policies and so on, and there are a few new ideas and so on as well that have been suggested. But overall, in your view, what do you feel would be the sort of the weaker aspects of this policy? If you were to pick one or two of these, which you felt could have been stronger or could have been done in a slightly different way?
One is that the entire chapter on professional education, right? If you read through it, we don't have enough detail on that. And while the principle of it is clear that there should not be any monofield institutions, but this whole matter that we have such a large professional education sector, medical through engineering through this, and they have so much of political power, so to say. How will that transformation happen? There is inadequate detail, inadequate fleshing out of that particular matter in that chapter. I think that's perhaps the weakest part of the policy. And, we've actually recommended in that chapter that another committee needs to be formed, which actually will then derive the transformation plan of the professional education sector from the way it is currently to what it should be. And what it should be on the basis of the principles that are articulated in this policy. But how will that happen? That's very, very, very inadequate, right? The other thing that I think is not as inadequate, but if you ask me, we don't have the same level of satisfaction with that as we would have with, let's say, early childhood education or the institutional restructuring of higher education, is this whole matter of vocational education. Again, I think the vocational education is stronger than the professional education part, but it's weaker than the rest of this thing. And also, again, because a lot more work needs to be done to understand what kind of vocations are required in this country for people to become self-reliant and also to be able to be, let's say, getting the kind of opportunities that the changing economy is offering them. Right? So I think those two parts are the relatively weaker parts. Professional education is explicitly recognized and stated that we have to form another committee to take it forward.
Right. So the last question, which is around, you've been closely involved in this process for a long time now, and so what has your overall personal kind of experience been with this, and what do you sort of see the future of the policy to be?
Pretty much everybody on the call must be familiar with the Kothari Commission, and all of you must be therefore familiar with Mr. J.P. Nayak, who was the member secretary and one of the most important figures in the history of education in India. Mr. Nayak, who was the member secretary of the Kothari Commission, in 1978 or 79 wrote a book called Education Commission and After. And so that essentially he was ruminating over what are the kind of mistakes that he ended up making, or I won't say he, but they ended up making, and what is his assessment 10 years after, right? So the reason I'm telling you that background story is that when we started on this whole thing in late 2017, actually all of us who were involved with this, we read this Education Commission and Master, right? Knowing fully well that there's going to be a repetition of the same thing, right? So one of the most clear dangers that is there with a policy of this kind is that it'll get implemented in piecemeal basis, and which was Mr. Nayak's, big problem, right? It'll get implemented in piecemeal basis, and when things get implemented in piecemeal basis, the easier things get implemented, the tougher things, which are the more fundamental issues, that don't get implemented, and so on. So I think that's a risk that stares us in the face, right? And to a greater extent or a lesser extent, that is going to happen. There's no doubt about that, right? But it's okay. I mean, that comes with the territory, because if you're talking about something as comprehensive as this and something for the next 20 odd years, this is going to happen. So I think that's the greatest apprehension that I would have, right? A lot of the stuff that we are talking about, and I started off with that, this explicit commitment to expanding, improving public education, a lot of that is swinging on the matter of higher investment. And if you look through the policy, the last chapter, the second last addendum, as we call it, not chapter, it talks about raising public expenditure from the current 10%, not percent of GDP, overall public expenditure that is there in the country, 10% of that is going into public education. The policy says it must go up to 20%, right? Now, piecemeal implementation and the money that is required to make it happen, those will be the greatest risks. On the whole, I would think that, my experience was absolutely wonderful. Many of you, those on the call, some of you I know, some of I don't know. I have no idea of your political leanings. When I say political leanings, both ideologically and party-wise. But what I can tell you is this, that having been through so intimately involved in this particular process, there was political interference. So nobody, neither Mr. Javadekar nor any other bigwig from any politically influential part told us that do this, do that, write this, don't write that. Nothing of that nature happened at all. Zero. So we had a pretty much free run. We did, I think, a huge amount of consultation. The list is there. It's not as though this stuff that is written there is some kind of arriving out of the fonts of wisdom that were writing it, but it actually is a reflective of very, very many people's inputs, ideas, thoughts. Not just people whom we consulted, but clearly also people who've been working in education for the past 30, 40 odd years, right? So it is built on, it's not something that's there in vacuum, or got constructed in vacuum. It builds clearly on, why Kothari Commission, from Radhakrishnan Commission onwards, it builds on that.
Right. Anurag, thank you so much for taking out the time to give us an overview of the draft national education policy. I think it has been immensely useful and valuable. And for the benefit of those friends and colleagues who joined a little later or who are not involved in the initial chain mails, we have circulated a summary of the draft national education policy. One is a 50-page summary, and other is a one-page summary of the policy, and we would strongly encourage you to go through it. It will give you much informed, it will help you make an informed view around this. We'll also put up the recording of this session online, share the link with everyone so that those of you the colleagues who could not attend it could also listen to it. Unfortunately, some people dropped out in between for a little while and might have missed some parts of it, so it will be useful for them as well. So once again, Anurag, thank you so much. Thank you to all our partners who have joined us for this conference call. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes your conference call for today. You may all disconnect your lines now. Thank you. Have a pleasant day.